She was 26 years old. She had dark hair she kept pinned up for work and let down on the weekends. And she drove a tan Ford Pinto with a cracked taillight that she kept meaning to fix. On the morning of April 7, 1983, Georgia Patricia Lynn Watkins kissed her 4-year-old son goodbye at her mother's kitchen table in Harland County, Georgia, told him she'd be back by supper, and walked out the front door into the spring sunshine. She was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who got lost. That is not a story about an accident. That is a story about a man who knew exactly where Georgia would be that morning, who knew the road she would take, and who had been waiting for an opportunity for longer than anyone in Harland County would have believed possible. It would take 40 years, a forensic tool that didn't exist when Georgia was born, and a detective who drove 3 hours from Atlanta on her own time to re-examine a case file no one else wanted, to finally close the door on what happened on that April road. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the spring of 1983. Because to understand what was taken from this world, you first have to understand who Georgia Patricia Lynn Watkins was. Harland County, Georgia, in 1983 was the kind of place where the phone book had 2 pages and everyone in it knew everyone else's business, without ever needing to read a word of it. It sat in the northwestern corner of the state, hill country more than flat Georgia, where the red clay roads ran between stands of pine and white oak, and the local radio station played gospel from 6 to 8 every Sunday morning before switching over to country. The county seat, a town called Millhaven, had a hardware store, a Piggly Wiggly, 2 Baptist churches, a Pentecostal church, and a diner called Dots, where the coffee was bad and nobody cared because they weren't there for the coffee. Georgia had grown up in Millhaven. She was the middle child of Raymond and Laverne Watkins, a family that had farmed tobacco on the same land since Raymond's grandfather had cleared it in 1919. She had graduated from Millhaven High in 1975, the same year that American Graffiti was still playing on television, when 8-track players were winding down and everyone was starting to hear about this new thing called a cassette tape, and had taken a job at Harland County Cooperative Extension, helping farm families access federal agriculture programs. It was steady, unglamorous work that suited her. She was good at explaining forms to people who didn't have much patience for paperwork. She had a talent for making complicated things sound simple, which is rarer than it sounds. Her son, Brandon, was born in 1979. His father had left the county before Brandon was old enough to remember him. Georgia had not spent much energy being bitter about it. She had moved back into her parents' house on Old Quarry Road and was saving money toward a place of her own. By the winter of 1982, she had enough for a small deposit. She had looked at a house on Sycamore Lane in January and told her sister Joyce that it had a good back porch. The kind of porch where you could sit with coffee in the morning and hear the birds before the rest of the day started. She was still saving, still planning. She had entered Brandon in the kindergarten lottery for the fall. Her coworker at the extension office, a woman named Margie Holt, would tell investigators later that Georgia had been in a good mood the week she disappeared. She had laughed at something Margie said on Tuesday. A real laugh. The kind you don't have to manufacture. She wasn't someone who faked anything, Margie said. You knew where you stood with Georgia. On Thursday, April 7th, Georgia told her mother she was going to drive out to see about a fence line dispute at the Eldridge farm, 7 miles east of town. It was the kind of routine field visit she made 2 or 3 times a month. She packed her clipboard and her files. She kissed Brandon's forehead. She backed the Pinto out of the driveway. No one at the Eldridge farm ever saw her arrive. The Eldridge family was the first to call. Glenn Eldridge had been waiting on Georgia from 9 a.m. onward, and by 11:15 he called the extension office to ask where she was. Margie Holt checked the schedule and confirmed Georgia had left for the Eldridge farm. She called Georgia's home number. No answer. At 12:40 p.m., a Harland County Sheriff's deputy named Lester Pruitt spotted the tan Pinto. It was pulled off on the shoulder of Piney Fork Road, a 2-lane stretch of blacktop that cut through a wooded section of county land between Millhaven and the Eldridge property. The car was unlocked. Georgia's clipboard was on the passenger seat. Her keys were in the ignition. The engine was off. The door was shut. Nothing appeared to have been forced. Pruitt called it in at 12:51 p.m. He walked the roadside in both directions. He walked the tree line. The woods ran deep on both sides of Piney Fork Road, old growth pine, dense understory, a dry creek bed about 50 yards in that he knew from deer season. He went as far as he could alone and then waited for backup. By 2 p.m., search teams were in the woods. By 4 p.m., the county had called in 2 neighboring sheriff's departments. Dogs were working the creek bed by evening. The extension office had closed early, and Margie Holt was on the phone calling every family Georgia had visited in the past month. 4-year-old Brandon sat at his grandmother Laverne's kitchen table and ate supper, and did not yet understand that his mother was not going to walk through the door. On the morning of April 9th, 46 hours after the Pinto had been found, searchers working the second dry creek bed east of Piney Fork Road found Georgia Patricia Lynn Watkins in the tree line. She had been moved from wherever the initial encounter had occurred. Court documents would later confirm she had been carried, not dragged, into the woods, a detail that investigators noted and filed away without yet understanding what it meant. No weapon was recovered. No footprints survived the pine straw. But lodged in the collar of Georgia's jacket, visible only under magnification, was a single synthetic fiber. Rust-colored. Acrylic blend. The kind of material used in work coveralls or heavy outerwear. It was collected, catalogued, and placed in the case evidence bag. In 1983, it was useless. It was just a thread. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Special Agent Dale Morrow of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, dispatched from the regional field office in Rome. Morrow was 41 years old, a methodical man who drove a GBI-issued Oldsmobile and kept a paper evidence log in handwriting so precise it looked typeset. He worked the Watkins case for 2 years without resolution. This was the case that he told his daughter, decades later, had never left him. In the first weeks, Morrow built a list of 24 men who had known Georgia Watkins, who had access to her schedule, who might have known she would be on Piney Fork Road that Thursday morning. Her work calendar was reconstructed from the office's carbon copy appointment book. The Eldridge farm visit had been scheduled 2 weeks in advance and noted on a form that was visible to anyone who walked past the scheduling desk in the extension office. The first person of interest was a man named Roy Fenter, Georgia's former landlord from a house she'd rented briefly in 1981. Fenter had made complaints about Georgia after she'd moved out, had called the extension office twice, for reasons that Margie Holt described as no real reason at all, and had no clear alibi for the morning of April 7th. Morrow interviewed him 3 times. Fenter was unpleasant and evasive in a way that suggested he had things to hide, though none of those things, as Morrow eventually confirmed, were connected to Georgia's death. Fenter was eliminated. The second person of interest never made it to the formal suspect list, but Morrow's notes from 1983 show he circled one name twice in the margin of a witness interview summary: Clifton Drury. Drury was 38 years old, a mechanic who owned a small automotive repair shop on the south end of Millhaven. A man who had fixed George's Pinto twice in the 18 months before her death. He was known in town as dependable and quiet. People took their cars to Clifton Drury because he didn't overcharge and he didn't talk too much. He attended Second Baptist. He had been married since 1971. He coached his son's Little League team on Saturday mornings. Morrow interviewed Drury in May of 1983. Drury said he had no knowledge of George's schedule, had not been on Piney Fork Road that Thursday, and had been working in his shop all morning, a claim partially supported by a customer who had dropped off a transmission at 8:30 a.m. and picked it up at noon. Morrow noted in his file that the pickup was at noon, that the middle hours of the morning were still unaccounted for. He also noted the shop was 3 miles from Piney Fork Road, but there was nothing to take to the district attorney. No physical evidence linking Drury to the scene. The fiber from George's collar was too generic to be traced to a specific garment. Without more, Morrow had a circled name and an unease he couldn't prove in any courtroom in Georgia. The GIB formally closed active investigation in the Watkins case in June of 1985. Laverne Watkins kept the case file number written on an index card taped to the inside of her kitchen cabinet. Margie Holt kept a photograph of Georgia on her desk at the extension office for as long as she worked there. And Morrow, who retired from the GBI in 1997, kept his personal notes in a manila envelope at the back of a filing cabinet in his study. When his wife asked him once why he didn't throw it away, he said he didn't have an answer for that. By 1990, Brandon Watkins was 11 years old, growing up on Old Quarry Road in his grandparents' house. He was a quiet boy who had inherited his mother's patience for detail and became, over time, a careful reader and a decent student. He didn't talk much about what had happened, partly because there was nothing to say that answered the question he was actually asking. His grandmother, Laverne, took him to the cemetery every April 7th. They brought wildflowers. They stood quietly. It was the closest thing the family had to a ritual of continuation. By 1995, 12 years after George's death, Clifton Drury's automotive shop had expanded. He had opened a second location in the next county over. He was active in his church. His son had graduated high school and his daughter was in middle school. He had repainted his house. He put up a flag on the 4th of July. He was, by every visible measure, a man living an ordinary, decent life. The house on Sycamore Lane that Georgia had planned to buy had been sold to another family in 1984, then again in 1989, then again in 1994. By 2003, the porch Georgia had admired was enclosed and screened in. The family living there had no reason to know who had once stood in their yard and imagined her son growing up in the morning birdsong from it. Brandon graduated from Millhaven High in 1997. He went to work for a construction company in Chattanooga, came back to Harland County in his late 20s to be closer to his grandparents. Raymond Watkins died in 2006. Laverne followed in 2011, still living in the house on Old Quarry Road, still with the case file number on the index card inside her cabinet. After Laverne passed, Brandon found the card. He took it with him. He kept it in his wallet. By 2019, the GIB had established a cold case unit with a new mandate to apply modern forensic tools to unsolved cases older than 10 years. A detective named Agent Renee Hollis was assigned to a rotating caseload that included, among others, the murder of Georgia Patricia Lynn Watkins, case number 83HC412. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verified against original records, to give these stories the care they deserve. If you want us to keep telling them, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now, let's get back to Georgia. Hollis drove to Harland County on a Saturday. She drove it on her own time. Agent Renee Hollis was 37 years old and had spent 12 years working homicide before joining the cold case unit. She had a habit of reading case files at her kitchen table on Sunday mornings with a second cup of coffee, the way other people read the newspaper. She read the Watkins file twice before she drove to Harland County. The second time, she slowed down at every page that contained a physical evidence log. The rust-colored synthetic fiber from George's jacket collar had been re-examined twice in the intervening decades, once in 1991 and once in 2004, without producing a useful result. What had changed by 2019 was the availability of a national textile forensic database that could now match fiber composition, weave pattern, and dye chemistry to specific manufacturers and product lines. Hollis submitted a re-examination request. The fiber was still viable. 4 decades in a properly sealed evidence container had kept it intact. The analysis came back in 8 weeks. The fiber was matched to a specific brand of mechanics coverall manufactured between 1978 and 1986 by a supplier that had sold primarily to independent auto repair shops in the southeastern United States. The composition was specific enough to narrow the source considerably. It wasn't proof, but it was a direction. Hollis pulled the original case file. She found Dale Morrow's notes. She found the circled name. She drove to Clifton Drury's house on a Thursday morning in November 2022. She did not call ahead. Drury was 77 years old, retired, living alone since his wife had passed in 2018. He answered the door in a flannel shirt, and when Hollis showed him her credentials, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. He didn't confess that day. But he didn't ask for a lawyer either, and the things he said during that conversation, things that Hollis had a recording device running for, as Georgia law permits, contained details about Piney Fork Road and the layout of the tree line east of the Dry Creek bed that had not been made public in 1983 or at any point since, details that existed only in the case file and in the memory of one other person. Hollis walked back to her car. She called the district attorney's office. She said, "I need a warrant, and I need it today." The search of Clifton Drury's property and the attached storage barn behind his house was conducted on November 19, 2022. The barn had not been substantially cleared since the 1980s. Stored in a wooden cabinet along the rear wall, wrapped in a plastic garbage bag, investigators found a pair of mechanics coveralls. Rust-colored. Acrylic blend, missing a section of material from the right collar seam, a section consistent in size and weave with the fiber recovered from Georgia Watkins's jacket 39 years earlier. The forensic match was confirmed in January 2023. Clifton Drury was arrested at his home on February 8, 2023, at 8:14 a.m. He came to the door the same way he had in November, flannel shirt, quiet face, no expression that people would later be able to name. The deputies had brought 2 vehicles. Drury did not resist. He was placed in handcuffs on his own front porch and walked to the patrol car. And the neighbors who came to their windows that morning saw a 77-year-old man being led away in the early light. And not one of them, not even the ones who had known him for 40 years, could fully reconcile what they were looking at with the man they thought they knew. The reaction in Millhaven was not what you would call loud. It was the quieter kind of devastation. The kind that comes when a community realizes it has been living alongside something it never looked at squarely. People who had let Clifton Drury work on their cars, who had sat next to him in the Second Baptist pew, who had watched him coach Little League on Saturday mornings in the same months that Georgia Watkins's family was planting wildflowers at a grave. Those people sat with their coffee and their silence and tried to find the words for a thing that resists easy language. Drury's son, who lived in Atlanta, issued a statement through an attorney saying only that the family was devastated and had no further comment. His daughter did not issue any statement at all. At the sentencing hearing in October 2023, Clifton Drury was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison. He was 78 years old. He made a brief statement before the judge. He said he was sorry. He said he had thought about it every day. No one in the courtroom who had known Georgia Watkins received those words as comfort, and no one was required to. Brandon Watkins was 44 years old and sitting in the front row of the courtroom. He did not look at Clifton Drury when Drury spoke. He looked at his hands. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, a local reporter asked him if he had anything to say. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother was going to buy a house with a good back porch. That's what I keep thinking about. She had plans." Georgia Patricia Lynn Watkins was 26 years old. She had dark hair she kept pinned up for work. She had a son she kissed on the forehead on an ordinary Thursday morning and told she'd be back by supper. She had a house she was saving for, a porch she had already imagined, a kindergarten lottery she had entered for the fall, a cracked taillight she kept meaning to fix. She had a whole life assembled from the ordinary, irreplaceable materials of an ordinary life. And it was taken from her on a 2-lane road in the spring of 1983 by a man who wore rust-colored coveralls and went home afterward and coached Little League on Saturday and put up a flag on the 4th of July and sat in a church pew and was, by every visible measure, simply a man in a small Georgia town. Dale Morrow, the GB agent who had circled Clifton Drury's name in 1983 and carried the case in a manila envelope for the rest of his life, died in 2015. He never knew. His daughter read about the conviction and sent a note to Brandon Watkins through the County Victims Services Office. She said her father had never stopped thinking about Georgia. Brandon wrote back. He said he was glad someone hadn't. The fiber from Georgia's collar had been in an evidence bag for 39 years. It had survived the closing of the original investigation, 2 inconclusive re-examinations, a change in GB administration, and a 40-year gap between the moment it was collected and the moment the science existed to make it speak. It was, in the end, the smallest possible thing, a thread from a work jacket, collected from a dead woman's collar by a deputy in 1983, who had been careful enough to bag it and tag it and make sure it made it to the evidence room. That care, that small act of doing the job right in the middle of an impossible morning, is the reason a 78-year-old man is sitting in a Georgia prison today. Before we leave Georgia's story, there are questions worth considering. Does a life sentence for a man who is nearly 80 years old feel like justice to you? Or does 40 years of freedom already represent a debt no courtroom can fully collect? What does it say about forensic science in 1983 that an investigator circled the right name and still had no way to prove it? And how many other cases from that era are sitting on the same edge, waiting for a technology that now exists? And what do we owe the people like Morrow and Hollis, investigators who carry cases home with them, on their own time, long after the system has moved on? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This community pays attention in ways that matter. Justice came for Georgia Patricia Lynn Watkins after 40 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth finding no matter how long it takes, Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.